I sat in my midtown penthouse overlooking the glittering lights of Atlanta. The city below was a sea of amber and white, but inside my home the atmosphere was cold and sharp. I held a glass of $500 Cabernet, the kind with deep notes of oak and a finish that tasted like vengeance. My thumb hovered over the play button on my phone. I had already heard the message once, but I needed to hear it again to ensure my heart was truly as numb as I felt. The voice of Mrs. Lurene. My mother filled the silent room. Her tone was not one of a parent, but of a judge delivering a final sentence. She told me that I was officially out of the family. She called me a dark cloud and a bitter, jealous spinster who brought nothing but bad luck to their doorstep. The venom in her voice was unmistakable when she announced that they were moving to the new Buckhead mansion tomorrow without me. She said that they had chosen Quentin and Kiara as the future of the family. She warned me never to show my face at the wedding or at the new house. According to her, I was a stain on the Anderson name that finally needed to be bleached away. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not feel the urge to throw my crystal glass against the marble island. Instead, I felt a strange, terrifying sense of relief. For 32 years, I had carried the weight of their expectations and their insults. I had been the silent pillar holding up a house that hated me for being too dark, too serious, and too successful. Mrs. Lurene had no idea that the very mansion she was boasting about was not a gift from Quentin. Quentin was a fraud with a bank account as empty as his promises. He did not buy that house. I did. Every cent of the lifestyle she enjoyed came from my salary, not from some mythical trust fund left by my father. The silence that followed the voicemail was the most honest moment of my life. I looked at the flickering lights of the Georgia Tech campus in the distance and realized the bridge had finally burned. My mother had just pulled the pin on a grenade she was holding in her own hand. She thought she was discarding a failure, but she was actually cutting off her only source of survival. I took a slow sip of my wine and felt the warmth spread through my chest. With a steady hand, I typed a 2-letter response. Okay, that was all she deserved. I set the phone down on the cold stone counter and began the process of reclaiming my life. By tomorrow morning, the locks would be changed, the accounts would be frozen, and the queen of the Anderson family would find out exactly what happens when the dark cloud decides to stop providing the rain. Hi everyone, I'm Ebony Justice Diaries. Welcome back to the channel. If you enjoy today's content, don't forget to hit the like button, share this video, and subscribe. Also, turn on notifications so you're the first to know when my latest videos drop. For 10 long years, my mother and sister lived a lie that I built for them with my own blood and sweat. They walked through life with their heads held high, boasting about the grand legacy of my late father. They told anyone who would listen that his brilliant investments had secured a trust fund large enough to keep them in designer pearls and country club memberships for a lifetime. The truth was far more pathetic. When my father passed away, he left behind nothing but a mountain of gambling debts and a stack of foreclosure notices. There was no trust fund. There was no hidden fortune. There was only a daughter who loved her family enough to hide their shame. I am Sloane, the woman they looked down upon while I was busy building an empire. While they spent their afternoons at high tea, I was navigating the cutthroat world of Atlanta real estate. I became a ghost in my own success, operating behind several limited liability companies to develop the luxury skyscrapers that defined the city skyline. Every single month, I would transfer $10,000 into my mother's account under the guise of an inheritance payout. I did this to protect her dignity and to ensure that Kiara never had to know the desperation of being poor. I was the architect of their comfort, yet they treated me like the hired help who was not quite good enough to sit at the main table. The betrayal I felt after hearing that voicemail acted like a cold blade cutting through my remaining hesitation. I picked up my phone and dialed my lead attorney, a man who knew every secret of my financial kingdom. I told him that the game was over. I instructed him to immediately freeze all auxiliary accounts associated with my primary holdings. I ordered the cancellation of the occupancy permit for the Buckhead mansion. I had purchased that property 6 months ago as a final gift to my family, but I had allowed Quentin to sign a dummy lease to make it look like he was the big provider. It was a charade designed to save Kiara from the embarrassment of marrying a man with zero assets. I told my lawyer to revoke the power of attorney I had granted my mother and to terminate the automatic transfers. By tomorrow morning, the golden faucet that had watered their garden of arrogance would be dry. They wanted to move on to Buckhead without me, so I decided to let them arrive at a house they could not enter and a life they could not afford. My mother had mistaken my silence for weakness, and my sister had mistaken my generosity for a birthright. They were about to learn that when you bite the hand that feeds you, you should not be surprised when that hand turns into a fist. The engagement party at the Ritz-Carlton was a masterpiece of my own making, yet I was treated like a trespasser in my own kingdom. I had signed the check for $50,000 to ensure every detail was perfect, from the silk linens to the premium open bar that flowed with the finest spirits. I wore a gown that cost more than Kiara's first car, a deep emerald silk that complemented my mahogany skin, but my mother looked at me with nothing but disdain. Before the first guest arrived, she pulled me aside into the service hallway. Her eyes drifted over my face with a cold, clinical detachment. She told me that I could not sit at the head table. She said that my presence in the official family photographs would throw off the aesthetic and make the portraits look cluttered. She claimed that my darker complexion and my stiff attitude would ruin the light and airy feel Kiara wanted for her social media feed. Instead of being the guest of honor who funded the entire evening, Mrs. Lurene ordered me to stand near the heavy gold doors of the ballroom. She told me to act as a greeter, to take coats, and to direct the important people toward the champagne tower. She literally told me to blend into the shadows because that was where I belonged. I stood there for 3 hours watching the elite of Atlanta's black society walk past me. They saw a servant, not the woman who was currently negotiating a $40 million land deal in the heart of the city. I felt the sting of every polite nod and every coat handed to me, but I kept my face as still as stone. My mother glided past me several times, laughing with her friends and bragging about how the Anderson family only settled for the best. She never once introduced me as her daughter. Then Quentin arrived looking every bit like the tech millionaire he claimed to be. He was draped in a tailored suit and wore a smile that was engineered to charm the jewelry off a woman's neck. Kiara clung to his arm like he was a life raft in a stormy sea. But as they walked past my station, I looked down. I saw the telltale signs of a desperate man trying to play a high-stakes game with no chips. His shoes were cheap knockoffs, the kind you buy from a street vendor for $50, but try to polish into looking like $2,000 Italian leather. The stitching was frayed at the heel, and the soles were glued, not sewn. As the night went on, I watched him from my post by the door. Quentin was supposed to be celebrating his future with my sister, but his eyes were constantly hunting. He wasn't looking at Kiara with love. He was busy scanning the room, calculating the net worth of the widows and the wealthy divorcees in attendance. I saw him linger a second too long near Mrs. Gable, whose family owned half the funeral homes in the state. He possessed the hungry look of a predator who had just realized his current prey was running out of meat. My mother was so blinded by the flash of his borrowed watch that she couldn't see the wolf in the room. I stood by those doors and realized that my family had invited a thief into the house, and they were punishing me for being the only one who could see his mask slipping. The air in the ballroom was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and even more expensive perfume, but the atmosphere turned frigid the moment I pulled my mother away from her circle of friends. I saw the way Quentin was working the room, and I knew I could not remain silent any longer. I leaned in and whispered to Mrs. Lurene that she was making a grave mistake. I told her that my investigators had found evidence that Quentin was drowning in debt and that his supposed tech company was nothing but a shell of unpaid bills and legal threats. I pleaded with her to look at the facts before Kiara tied her life to a sinking ship. I expected concern or perhaps a private conversation, but instead I received a physical blow that echoed through the silent Ritz-Carlton hall. Mrs. Lurene swung her hand with a precision that was meant to humiliate as much as it was meant to hurt. The crack of her palm against my cheek sounded like a gunshot. The influential ladies of the churchwomen who wore their Sunday best like armor gasped in unison and pressed their hands to their chests. My head snapped to the side, and the metallic taste of blood filled my mouth. My mother did not look regretful. Her eyes burned with a righteous fury as she leaned into my space. She shouted for everyone to hear that I was nothing but a bitter, jealous woman who could not stand to see her sister happy. She called me a hateful spinster who was trying to sabotage Kiara because I knew no man would ever want me. The insults did not stop there. She pointed a manicured finger at my chest and told the crowd that I was just a lowly secretary who had forgotten her place. She said that my fancy clothes and my quiet observations were just a mask for the envy that was rotting my soul. She told me that Quentin was a visionary and a success, while I was just a background player who was lucky to even be invited to such a prestigious event. To her, my warning was not an act of protection, but an act of war against the family's social climbing dreams. She looked at me with such pure, unadulterated loathing that I felt the last remaining thread of my loyalty finally snap. As the sting on my face began to throb, my mind flashed back to a rainy Tuesday, 17 years ago. I remembered the day I turned 15 years old, the day my mother decided that a new boyfriend was more important than her firstborn child. She had stood on the porch of our cramped apartment and handed me an envelope containing exactly $200. She told me then that I was too much of a burden and that I needed to find my own way in the world while she started her new life. I had survived on those $200, turning them into a fortune through grit and sacrifice, while she had spent the intervening years pretending she had raised me with love. Looking at her now, surrounded by the luxury I had paid for, I realized that she had not changed at all. She was still the same woman who would sell her daughter's soul for a taste of status. I wiped the blood from my lip, looked her straight in the eye, and felt a cold, hard peace settle over me. The debt was officially settled. The next morning, I walked into Glamour and Grace, the most exclusive hair salon for the black elite in Atlanta. The air was thick with the scent of peppermint oil, expensive hairspray, and the faint, lingering smell of burning sage. It was the kind of place where reputations were built and destroyed over a single wash and set. I settled into a deep leather chair at the back, hidden behind a large potted palm with a silk scarf wrapped around my hair. I had no intention of making a scene yet. I just wanted to hear the truth. I did not have to wait long. From the center of the room near the grand mirrors, I heard the unmistakable high-pitched laugh of my mother, Mrs. Lurene. She was holding court, while Kiara sat in the chair next to her, getting her nails painted a shimmering bridal white. Mrs. Lurene was draped in a silk robe, waving a hand in the air as if she were preaching a sermon. She was telling anyone who would listen about their impending move to the Buckhead mansion. She spoke about the marble floors and the 20-foot ceilings as if she had earned them herself. Then her voice dropped into a tone of mock pity that carried across the entire room. She told the circle of women, most of whom were in their late 60s, and loved a good piece of gossip, that she had finally done what should have been done years ago. She said she had swept the trash out of her house. She was referring to me, her own daughter, as if I were nothing more than a pile of dust on a rug. Kiara chimed in with a cruel giggle, loud enough for the shampoo girls to hear. She mocked the idea of me living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment in a bad part of town. She joked that I would probably have to sell my designer bags just to pay a security deposit on a rental. The room was filled with the sound of whispering as the older ladies clucked their tongues in feigned disapproval. They whispered about how sad it was that Sloane had become so bitter and how she had finally pushed her loving mother too far. Mrs. Lurene sighed dramatically, claiming that some children are just born with a dark spirit that no amount of prayer can fix. She told the ladies that she was finally free of my shadow and that her life would now be nothing but sunshine and Buckhead luxury. I sat there in the silence of my own anger, listening to them bury my name in the dirt while I held the keys to everything they owned in my purse. I stood up from the shampoo station and unwrapped the silk scarf from my head, letting my hair fall perfectly over my shoulders. The idle chatter in the salon died down instantly as I stepped into the light. My mother froze with her glass of mimosa halfway to her lips, and Kiara nearly smudged her fresh white polish. The silence was so heavy that you could hear the hum of the hairdryers in the back. I walked toward the front desk, where Miss Claudette, the owner, stood, with her mouth slightly open. I did not look at my mother yet. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out my titanium black card, laying it on the counter with a soft but commanding thud. I told Miss Claudette that I wanted to pay for every single woman in the building. I scanned the room, looking at the 20 stunned faces of the church elders and the hard-working young stylists. I told her to calculate the total for every wash, every cut, every weave, and every manicure being performed at this very moment. The total came to $4,800. I swiped the card without blinking. Then I leaned closer to the desk and clarified my instructions in a voice that was as sharp as a razor blade. I told her that my generosity extended to everyone in the room except for the 2 women sitting in chairs number 1 and 2. I pointed directly at Mrs. Lurene and Kiara. The gasps that followed were like a wave crashing against the walls. My mother's face turned a deep, bruised purple as she realized she was being publicly excluded from my wealth. I finally turned my gaze toward her, looking directly into her eyes with a coldness that made her flinch. I told her that since she was so confident in her new life, she should have no trouble paying for her own vanity. I told her to enjoy this final moment of luxury and to make sure she saved the receipt. I suggested that she should start using Quentin's money to fund her lifestyle from now on, assuming that his imaginary millions actually existed. I told her that the Bank of Sloane was officially closed for business and that the grace period had expired. Kiara tried to speak, her voice trembling with embarrassment, but I silenced her with a single look. I told them both that they should get used to the feeling of being left behind because the Buckhead dream was about to become a nightmare. I turned back to the room and wished the other ladies a beautiful day, leaving the salon, while the whispers erupted like a wildfire behind me. For the first time in my life, I felt the true power of my own success, and I knew that the look of shock on my mother's face was worth every single penny of that $4,800. The sun was high over the manicured lawns of Buckhead when the Anderson family arrived in a parade of arrogance. 2 massive moving trucks, each 26 feet long, sat idling at the curb like obedient beasts. Mrs. Lurene stepped out of a black town car, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a white linen suit that screamed old money, even though every thread was paid for by the daughter she had just disowned. Kiara followed her, draped in a silk sundress and holding her phone aloft to record every second for her 30,000 followers. She was narrating the moment with a high-pitched excitement, calling the mansion their new ancestral home and bragging about the exclusive neighborhood. They looked like royalty prepared to claim a throne, completely oblivious to the fact that the Locks had no memory of their existence. Quentin led the way to the massive mahogany front doors, swaggering with the false confidence of a man who believed his own lies. He adjusted the jacket of his suit and looked back at my mother with a wink, promising her that the interior was even more magnificent than the brochures. He reached for the digital keypad, his fingers dancing over the buttons to enter the code I had supposedly given him as part of his fake lease agreement. The keypad emitted a sharp red flash and a low, mocking beep. He frowned, his brow furrowing, as he tried the numbers again, slower this time. Once more the red light flickered like an angry eye. I watched from a blacked-out sport utility vehicle parked 50 yards down the street, sipping cold water and watching the sweat begin to bead on his forehead. The confusion on the porch quickly turned into a frantic desperation. Mrs. Lurene began to complain about the heat, her voice rising in pitch, as she demanded to know why they were still standing on the sidewalk. Kiara stopped recording and started pacing her heels, clicking against the stone steps like a ticking clock. Quentin tried the code for a 5th time, punching the buttons so hard that his knuckles turned white, but the door remained as immovable as a mountain. Just as he began to suggest that the system was malfunctioning, 2 white security vehicles with amber flashing lights pulled into the circular driveway blocking the moving trucks. 4 uniformed officers stepped out of the cars, their faces set in grim expressions of authority. The lead officer, a man with 20 years of experience written in the lines of his face, asked who was in charge of this gathering. Quentin tried to play the role of the wealthy homeowner, puffing out his chest and claiming there was a simple misunderstanding with the security system. The officer did not blink. He looked at his tablet and informed the group that the actual owner of the property had called in a trespassing report 10 minutes ago. He stated clearly that the Anderson family and their associates were currently attempting to enter a private residence without authorization. He told them that if they did not vacate the premises within 5 minutes, they would all be processed for illegal entry. The Instagram filters could not hide the look of pure, unadulterated terror that washed over my mother's face as she realized the gates of her paradise were locked tight. Gemini Knee I stepped out of the black sport utility vehicle and walked toward the chaos unfolding on the driveway. The heavy, humid air of Georgia felt thick with the smell of coming rain and the stench of desperation. My mother looked at me as if she were seeing a ghost, her face contorting with a mixture of hope and fury. She screamed for me to tell the officers that there had been a mistake, that I should use my connections to fix this embarrassment immediately. I did not move to hug her. I did not offer a word of comfort. Instead, I handed a thick leather folder to the lead officer. Inside were the original deeds and the corporate registration for the property, showing that every single square inch of the $5 million estate belonged to my firm. I looked at the officer and stated clearly that I was the owner and that I had never authorized a lease for a man named Quentin. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the wind through the oak trees. Quentin tried to step forward, his hands shaking as he adjusted his fake gold watch. He stammered about a private agreement and a wire transfer that was supposed to have cleared. One of the officers, who had been running a background check on his mobile terminal, stepped toward Quentin with a pair of steel handcuffs. He informed the group that Quentin was not even his real name. His actual name was Arthur Jenkins, a career con artist with 3 active warrants for grand larceny and wire fraud across 2 neighboring states. My mother gasped, clutching her pearls so hard that the string nearly snapped. Kiara looked as if she were about to faint, her eyes darting between her disgraced fiancé and the cold metal cuffs now encircling his wrists. The officer revealed a deeper layer of the betrayal that made the blood drain from Kiara's face. He explained that Quentin, or Arthur, had been under investigation for months. His entire plan had been to marry into what he believed was a wealthy family with a massive trust fund. He had been using forged documents to pretend he was a millionaire in order to lure Kiara into a quick marriage. Once the papers were signed, he intended to gain access to the accounts held by Mrs. Lurene. He thought he was playing a long game to steal my mother's fortune, never realizing that the fortune he was hunting was actually mine. He was a predator who had accidentally tried to rob another predator, and he had lost everything in the process. I stood there and watched as the police led him away to the patrol car. He did not look like a tech mogul anymore. He looked like a small, broken thief caught in a trap of his own making. My mother turned to me, her voice trembling as she realized the gravity of her situation. She began to beg, reminding me of all the years she had spent raising me and asking me to let them stay in the house just for one night. I looked at her, seeing the woman who had called me a dark cloud and a failure just 24 hours ago. I told her that she should have checked the weather report before she decided to throw me away. I told the officers that I wanted everyone off my property immediately, including the moving trucks. I watched as my family stood on the sidewalk with nothing but their designer suitcases and a mountain of lies, realizing that the man they had chosen over me was currently sitting in the back of a police car. The sun began to set over the city, casting long, bruised shadows across the pavement, as Mrs. Lurene and Kiara retreated from the gates of Buckhead. They drove back to the modest suburban house they had inhabited for years, defeated and exhausted, only to find a scene that looked like a disaster zone. The front lawn was covered in their belongings. Her velvet sofa sat tilted in the grass, and Kiara's designer shoeboxes were piled near the curb like colorful tombstones. I had hired a professional moving crew to clear the house within 2 hours of the eviction notice being signed. Every piece of furniture I had purchased and every appliance I had upgraded was now sitting out in the open air, exposed to the judgmental stares of the neighbors. Mrs. Lurene stood in the middle of the driveway, her white linen suit now wrinkled and stained with sweat. She frantically pulled out her phone to check her banking app, hoping for a miracle or a mistake. But the screen revealed the cold, hard reality of her situation. The balance displayed exactly $0.00. The $10,000 monthly allowance I usually provided had been clawed back by my legal team due to the fraudulent nature of her recent claims. She was a woman who had spent decades pretending to be a queen, but now she stood in a kingdom of cardboard boxes with no crown and no currency. My phone vibrated on the marble counter of my penthouse. I answered it on the third ring, listening to the chaotic symphony of her desperation. She started with the usual fire screaming that I was an ungrateful monster, and that I would burn in hell for treating my mother this way. But within 60 seconds the fire died out and was replaced by a pathetic, trembling sob. She began to beg. She told me she was old and that Kiara was just a child who didn't know any better. She asked me how I could let them sleep on the street. I waited for her to finish, my heart as steady as a surgeon's hand. I told her that I was simply fulfilling her wishes. I reminded her of her own words from the voicemail. I told her that since I am just a dark cloud, I decided it was time to move on so she wouldn't have to stand in my shadow anymore. I hung up the phone before she could say another word. While the rest of the family treated me like a pariah, Auntie V was the only one who dared to walk through the fire to stand by my side. She was my mother's younger sister, but they were cut from entirely different cloths. Auntie V had spent 30 years working as a head nurse, and she had a way of seeing through people like they were made of cheap glass. She arrived at my penthouse that evening not with a handout for money, but with a heavy heart and a folder full of truths that she could no longer bear to hide. She sat on my velvet sofa and looked at me with eyes that mirrored my own exhaustion. She told me that she had watched in silence for too long, as my mother, Mrs. Lurene, systematically bled me dry while whispering poison about my character to anyone who would listen. Auntie V began to reveal the staggering extent of the financial gluttony that had been happening behind my back. She told me that the $10,000 I sent every month was only the tip of the iceberg. My mother had been opening lines of credit in my name, using her knowledge of my personal details to fund a secret life of reckless extravagance. Auntie V showed me records of luxury cruises to the Caribbean and high-stakes gambling trips to Atlantic City that my mother had taken, while telling me she needed extra money for her heart medication. She had spent over $50,000 in a single year on designer gowns and vintage champagne, all while claiming that I was a stingy daughter who left her to suffer in poverty. The most painful revelation came when Auntie V described how my mother had manipulated Kiara. She had taught my sister that my hard work was a family resource to be exploited, not a gift to be respected. Auntie V confessed that she had overheard my mother telling Kiara that I was only successful because I was too plain and boring to have a real life of my own, so the money I earned should belong to the beautiful members of the family who actually knew how to live. Hearing this from Auntie V was the final confirmation I needed. The betrayal was not just a momentary lapse in judgment, it was a calculated decade-long heist of my soul. Auntie V took my hand and told me that she would testify in court if I needed her to. She said that a mother who feasts on her own child's flesh does not deserve a seat at the table. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had a real ally in the war for my own future. Gemini. Ni Sunday morning at Hope of Zion was usually a time for peace and spiritual reflection, but today the air was thick with the scent of a carefully staged tragedy. I walked into the sanctuary and felt the temperature drop as 100 pairs of eyes turned toward me. At the very front of the church, near the altar where the choir usually stood, was my mother. Mrs. Lurene had always been a master of theater, and today she was giving the performance of her life. She was draped in a somber black dress that looked like it belonged at a funeral, and her face was a mask of calculated misery. She was not just crying, she was wailing with a theatrical grief that echoed off the high vaulted ceilings. She had gathered a circle of the church elders around her, clinging to their hands, as if she were a drowning woman reaching for a lifeline. Her voice rose in a trembling crescendo as she began to address the congregation. She spoke about the sanctity of the fifth commandment and the duty of a child to honor her parents. She told the crowd that she had been cast out into the cold by her own flesh and blood. She described how she had been forced to stand on the sidewalk while her belongings were tossed into the dirt like common trash. She called me an ungrateful daughter who had been blinded by the glimmer of gold and the pride of the world. She sobbed that I had stolen her security and left her homeless in her twilight years, all while I lived in a palace of luxury in Midtown. The murmurs of the congregation grew louder, a low rumble of disapproval that rolled through the pews like an approaching storm. People who had known me since I was a child looked at me with disgust, whispering that money had turned my heart into a stone. Kiara stood beside her, playing the role of the devoted, suffering sister. She wiped fake tears from her eyes and nodded along to every lie my mother uttered. They were painted as the innocent victims of a cold and calculating villain. The atmosphere in the church became suffocating. I stood in the back, my spine straight, and my face expressionless, watching the woman who had birthed me use the house of God as a weapon to destroy my reputation. I saw the deacons shaking their heads and the ushers crossing their arms in a silent wall of judgment. They saw a grieving mother in black, and they saw a daughter who appeared to have no soul. The tension reached its peak when Reverend Miller stepped forward. He was a man of great stature who had led this community for over 30 years, and his word was considered law within these walls. He placed a hand on my mother's shaking shoulder and looked directly at me with a gaze that was meant to shame me into submission. The music from the organ died down, leaving a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. The Reverend cleared his throat, his voice deep and booming as he prepared to deliver a public reprimand. He began to speak about the dangers of greed and the spiritual rot that comes when one forgets their roots. He was seconds away from calling me to the altar to repent for my supposed sins. My mother looked at me through the lace of her veil, and for a split second the crying stopped. She gave me a tiny, triumphant smirk that no one else could see. She thought she had won. She thought the community would force me to open my checkbook once again, just to escape the shame. But she had forgotten that the truth does not need a choir to be heard. I did not walk to the pulpit to argue or scream at the woman who gave me life. Instead, I moved with a cold and quiet purpose toward the sound booth at the back of the sanctuary, where the young technicians were frozen in shock. I pulled out my phone and connected it to the church multimedia system. Within seconds, the two massive screens hanging on either side of the altar, which were usually reserved for hymn lyrics and scriptures, flickered to life with digital files. The entire church fell into a deathly silence as I pressed play on the voicemail Mrs. Lurene had sent me less than 24 hours ago. My mother's voice erupted through the speakers, not as the sobbing victim she pretended to be, but as a snarling tyrant. Everyone heard her call me a dark cloud and a bitter spinster. They heard her boast about moving to Buckhead without me and telling me to never show my face again. The contrast between the woman kneeling in black lace and the venomous voice booming through the hall made the people in the front pews recoil. I did not stop there. I began to scroll through 10 years of bank statements. Huge numbers flashed on the screens, showing a total of over $1,200,000 that I had transferred into her accounts. I pointed out the specific charges for luxury cruises and designer boutiques that she had enjoyed while claiming I left her to suffer. The final blow was the criminal profile of Quentin, also known as Arthur Jenkins. His mugshot appeared in high definition, alongside a list of 12 counts of felony fraud and grand larceny. I explained clearly through the audio system that the man my mother praised as a tech millionaire was a career predator who was hunting my assets. I showed the evidence that the Buckhead mansion was purchased by my firm and that Quentin was nothing but a fraudulent tenant. The church fell into a silence so profound that you could hear the frantic breathing of Mrs. Lurene from across the room. The humiliation reversed its course like a tidal wave. The judgmental stares that were once aimed at me now turned toward my mother and sister with pure disgust. The church elders who had just been holding my mother's hand quickly pulled away as if they had touched something diseased. Reverend Miller stood motionless, his face shifting from sternness to a deep and visible horror. Mrs. Lurene stood exposed, her black veil no longer able to hide the truth that she had been completely unmasked before the community she craved to impress. I disconnected my phone and looked at her one last time. I did not see a mother. I only saw a con artist who had run out of time. I had used the truth to burn down her castle of lies, and in the ashes, I was the only one left standing. I walked down the center aisle of the church, the sound of my heels striking the floor like the steady beat of a drum. The congregation remained frozen, caught in the wreckage of the lies I had just demolished. I stopped directly in front of my mother, who was now trembling with a mixture of fear and naked shame. She looked up at me, her eyes searching for a shred of the daughter who used to beg for her approval, but she found only a woman who had finally learned her own worth. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a single slip of paper. It was a check for $200, the exact amount she had used to buy her freedom from me nearly 2 decades ago. I took her cold, limp hand and pressed the check into her palm, folding her fingers over it with a firm and final grip. I told her that this was the $200 she had given me on the porch when I was 15 years old. I told her that I was returning it with 17 years of interest in the form of the life I had built without her help. I looked her straight in the eye and stated clearly that we were now officially even. I told her that she no longer owed me the title of mother, and I no longer owed her the duty of a daughter. I declared that the debt of our blood was settled, and from this moment forward, we were strangers who happened to share a history of pain. The silence in the sanctuary was absolute as I turned my back on her for the last time. Auntie V stepped forward and linked her arm with mine, her head held high with a quiet pride that gave me more strength than any bank account ever could. Together, we walked toward the heavy oak doors, leaving behind the gasps of the neighbors and the shattered remains of the Anderson reputation. I did not look back to see Kiara crying or my mother staring at the check in her hand. I walked out into the bright Georgia sunlight and felt the heavy chains of 32 years finally fall away. I was no longer a provider or a dark cloud. I was simply Sloane, and for the first time in my life, I was free. The car glided smoothly away from the curb of the church, leaving the chaos and the whispers of Hope of Zion far behind. I sat in the back seat of the black sedan watching the silhouettes of my mother and sister grow smaller in the rear window until they were nothing but tiny specks against the red brick of the sanctuary. For the first time in 32 years, the air in my lungs felt clean and light. The invisible chains that had bound my heart to their constant demands and their cruel judgments had finally shattered. I watched the green landscape of Georgia fly past the window, and I felt a profound sense of peace that no amount of money in my bank account could ever provide. I looked at Auntie V, who was sitting beside me with a gentle smile of approval on her face. She reached over and patted my hand, confirming that I had done the right thing. I realized then that I had spent a decade trying to buy a seat at a table where I was never truly welcome. I had believed that if I worked hard enough and provided enough luxury, they would finally see my worth and love me for who I was. But today taught me that love is not a transaction. It cannot be bought with Buckhead mansions or $500 bottles of wine. If someone does not value your soul, they will only ever value your wallet. As we drove toward the horizon where the sun was beginning to set in a blaze of orange and purple, I felt like a new woman. My self-respect was the most valuable asset I now possessed, and it was the only thing I was no longer willing to spend on people who did not deserve it. I had rumbled the foundation of their lies and reclaimed my own narrative. The road ahead was wide and open, free from the dark clouds of their manipulation. I closed my eyes and leaned my head back against the leather seat, breathing in the sweet scent of freedom. I was no longer the silent provider for an ungrateful family. I was Sloane, and my new life was just beginning under a bright and beautiful sky. This story teaches us a powerful lesson. Family is not defined by blood alone, but by the respect and love they show you in your darkest hours. You cannot pour from an empty cup, and you certainly shouldn't pour into hearts that refuse to appreciate your worth. True wealth is not found in the mansions of Buckhead or the glitter of Midtown, but in the peace of a mind that no longer accepts mistreatment. Remember, setting a boundary is not an act of revenge. It is a sacred commitment to your own soul's survival and happiness.